In the midst of a succession crisis within the Kingdom of Scotland, between 1296 and 1357, a series of battles took place between English invaders and Scottish defenders during what became known as the Wars of Scottish Independence. During these turbulent years, many a great Scottish legend would be created, though the overall outcome would be something of a stalemate between the two sides. As mentioned, the First War of Scottish Independence came about due to a succession crisis. In 1286, the then King of Scotland, Alexander III, accidentally fell from his horse and died while out riding near Edinburgh. His only son, Prince Alexander, had predeceased him in 1284 at the age of 20, while his sister, Margaret, Queen of Norway, had also died a year prior to her brother. This left Margaret's daughter, also Margaret, Maid of Norway, who was only 3 years old at the time of her grandfather's passing, to become the Queen Designate of Scotland, with ministers running the country in her stead. Margaret was ultimately never crowned queen, as she died in 1290 at the age of 7 from what was believed to be food poisoning. The crisis of succession was thus reignited, leading to a competition held between 13 potential candidates, that was gradually whittled down to 2, John Balliol and Robert Bruce. To help select their future monarch, the Scots turned to whom they believed was an independent adjudicator, King Edward I of England. Unsurprisingly, Edward had his own plans for the conquest of Scotland and sought to place the more supportive John Balliol upon the throne as a precursor to his own invasion of the country. The Scottish kingdom would then become a vassal state of England, with John Balliol as a puppet ruler. Balliol, on becoming Scottish king, owed fealty to King Edward, effectively recognising him as the overall Lord of Scotland. Edward proceeded to undermine the power of the Scottish lords and even summoned King John Balliol to stand before the English court as a common plaintiff, the perceived weakness of John giving rise to his nickname of Tomb Tabard or Empty Coat. However, John was not pleased with his power being usurped by Edward, and thus in March 1296 renounced his homage to the English king. Edward's immediate response, within weeks of Balliol's declaration, was to invade Scotland by storming and sacking the border town of Berwick-upon-Tweed. A month later, the first major battle between the English and the Scots at Dunbar took place, during which the Scots were thoroughly routed, the subsequent advance of Edward's forces upon Edinburgh forcing John to abdicate in July 1296. The English king instructed his officers to receive formal homage from some 1,800 Scottish nobles, many of whom were prisoners of war at the time. Edward then established an oppressive English administration to rule the country, with John de Warenne, 6th Earl of Surrey, as governor, and Hugh Cressingham as financial advisor. The suppression of the Scottish didn't last long, though, as in early 1297, 2 patriots, Andrew de Moray and William Wallace, led their people in open revolt against the English. Underlying this for Wallace in particular was an overwhelming hatred of the invaders from the south, a hatred stoked by the murder of his wife and children at the hands of the English, when his farmhouse in Lanarkshire had been burned by the invaders, together with the death of his father, brother, and other kinsmen who fell in battle against the invaders. Wallace, while an incomparable guerrilla leader, lacked the experience and judgment needed for large-scale warfare. Warenne and Cressingham assembled an army of around 9,000 men, who marched north through the Scottish lowlands in response to an army of 6,000 raised by Wallace, which was besieging the town of Dundee. With word reaching Wallace that a large English army was approaching, he abandoned his siege of Dundee and promptly marched south to meet Warenne and Cressingham's force, regardless of the fact that he was severely outnumbered. The two armies encountered each other on either side of the upper reaches of the River Forth, just north of Stirling, with the only crossing being a wooden bridge supported by stone pillars, wide enough for only 2 persons to pass at a time. Warenne, desperate to launch an assault on Wallace's army, gathered at the far end of the causeway leading to the bridge, proposing that his army crosses at this position. Sir Richard Lunday, a Scottish knight serving in the English army, had strong opposition to the plan, knowing the area well, and informed Warenne that there was a ford some 2 miles upstream, where the road to the northeast crossed the River Forth. This would allow the English army to cross the river 50 abreast, thereby ensuring that there was no point at which a small part of the army would be isolated and exposed to the Scottish attack. Warenne, primarily an administrator, was in a precarious position due to various circumstances surrounding the wider battle, being threatened with replacement as governor by King Edward due to his inability to quickly suppress the rebellion. In addition, much of his army was comprised of Scots, adherents of Balliol, among them the Earl of Lennox, whose loyalty to the English cause was questionable at best. Warenne, hoping to avoid battle, dispatched 2 local Dominican friars with a message to Wallace urging him to surrender to the English army, though the Scottish leader was not interested in peace. The Scottish response enraged the English knights, and at the behest of Cressingham, Warren's army began to cross in narrow file over Stirling Bridge on September 11, 1297, while Lunde's offer to lead a force across the ford and attack Wallace's flank was ignored. The result was that Cressingham, at the head of the army, only had half his force on the northern bank of the River Forth by 11 a.m., at which point he moved to attack Wallace's positions. This initial thrust was decimated by Scottish archers, forcing the remnants to retreat back to the river, only to find the Scots had moved around the English flank and cut off their escape back across the Forth. At this point, the main body of Scottish horsemen, led by Wallace, Sir John Graham of Dundaff, Ramsay of Dalhousie, and other Scots nobles, charged the retreating vanguard, leading to a massacre as the English were either cut down on the riverbank or drowned in the river trying to escape. Desperate to rescue Cressingham, Warren ordered more of his men across the bridge until the centre section eventually collapsed from the weight, sending his knights tumbling into the river and cutting off all means of retreat for those troops now isolated on the north bank. Meanwhile, the Scots, with intimate knowledge of the local countryside, used Lunde's ford as a means of crossing the Forth and advanced on the rear of Warren's army, leading to outright panic as the English attempted to escape the assault. The Scots barons, serving with the English, deciding at this moment to change side, and savagely slaughtered men who they had considered comrades only minutes earlier, the English troops being pursued and killed over the course of many miles as they fled the battle, with up to 100 English cavalry and 5,000 infantry meeting their demise during this confrontation against minor Scots casualties, John de Warenne escaping to York, while Cressingham was cut down and his body viciously mutilated by the Scottish victors. In the wake of the horrendous defeat at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, King Edward I returned from France and ordered the northern English nobles to assemble with their armies in late May 1298 at York for a further invasion of Scotland. Before agreeing to march against the Scots, the English barons attempted to make King Edward swear to observe the Magna Carta, an obligation King Edward sidestepped, declaring that once the Scots were defeated, he would take the oath. Meanwhile, the Scots launched a series of raids against Newcastle and Carlisle in revenge for the English invasion of 1296, returning with sizable plunder that helped to fund the improvement of their army and future defence of their homeland. In June 1298, King Edward once again led an army north into Scotland along the east coast, which was comprised of 3,000 heavily armoured cavalry and 4,000 light cavalry, with 500 Gascon knights and men-at-arms, only halting for a month at Kirkliston to await the arrival of supplies travelling by sea. William Wallace, aware of the English approach, preparing to make a stand at the town of Falkirk, where he intended to give battle to King Edward, a commonly held belief being that many Scottish noblemen refused to serve under William Wallace due to his low social standing, and thus were not at his side to support him in the forthcoming battle. The king's army was also suffering, as a dispute arose in Edward's camp between his English and Welsh contingents, which led to infighting between the two national groups, the Welsh threatening to leave the army and join the Scots. Wallace took this opportunity to organise a night attack on the English camp, but his plans were disclosed to Edward by Gilbert de Umfraville, Earl of Angus, and Patrick, Earl of Dunbar. Edward, in an attempt to forestall Wallace, marching his army to Linlithgow prior to launching an attack on the Scots in the forests of Falkirk. On the night of July 21, 1298, Edward and his army camped in their armour in the open fields without tents or supplies. As the king slept, his horse became disturbed and trampled the monarch under hoof, breaking 3 of his ribs and crushing part of his armour, leading to brief confusion as the king's cries of anguish were taken to be the Scottish attacking, leading to the English army being forced to stand to, though Edward was soon able to reassure his men and the army returned to its rest. The next day, the king, despite his injuries, advanced towards Falkirk, causing the Scots reconnaissance patrol to return to Wallace with news that the English were on the move. In preparation for the battle, the English army briefly halted while Andrew de Bec, Bishop of Durham, celebrated Mass from the back of his horse, this ill-timed interlude giving the Scottish army time to muster, with a mass of Scots pikemen clustered in 3 formations, separated by archers to provide support. The Scots were not immune to their own squabbling, with an argument arising between the Scottish nobles as to which of them would lead the attack, Sir John Stuart claiming to lead the Scots by virtue of his relationship to his brother, the hereditary Lord High Steward of Scotland, while John Comyn claimed the honour by virtue of his descent from King David, and Wallace due to him being legally authorised guardian of the country. This heated debate taking place as the English launched their attack, who were able to advance directly upon the Scots, as influenced by the presence of thick marshland caused by the meeting of two streams, which forced the English to go around this area in order to assault the Scottish positions. The English men-at-arms were unable to penetrate the Scottish pikemen and were subjected to heavy fire from the archers, though the Scots' defence was subsequently broken when John Comyn, with his cavalry and reserve at the rear, abandoned the battlefield due to him taking offence at not being allowed to command the entire army. In the subsequent confusion, the Scottish formation was broken as English and Welsh archers of the King's Reserve came up to lay suppressive fire into their ranks, the Scots retreating in disorganised fashion, Wallace being reported to have fought with his two-handed longsword until nightfall, after which he turned and escaped the field on horse. The outcome of the Battle of Falkirk being heavy Scottish casualties, which included noblemen Sir John Stewart, Sir John Graham of Dundaff, and the Earl of Fife, while the English also suffered heavy losses from Scottish archers. The Battle of Falkirk essentially destroyed both the Scottish defence against the English invaders, but also the military reputation of William Wallace, who would revert back to guerrilla warfare as King Edward sought to re-establish English rule in Scotland. Wallace was ultimately replaced as Guardian of the Kingdom jointly by Robert Bruce and John Comyn, though neither of these men could see beyond their personal differences, leading to yet another political upheaval for the Scots. In 1299, Pope Boniface VIII issued a papal decree to force the release of the imprisoned king, John Balliol, into the custody of Rome, and condemned Edward's invasions of Scotland, insisting he desist from any further attacks and begin negotiations with the Scottish nobles, though this was ignored by Edward, who led another campaign into Scotland during May 1300 to invade Annandale and Galloway. Wallace, meanwhile, sought support for the Scottish cause from King Philip IV of France, with William Lamberton, Bishop of St Andrews, being appointed as neutral guardian of the kingdom to ensure Robert Bruce and John Comyn didn't descend into their own civil war in his absence. This lack of unity in the Scots leadership meaning the defenders could have easily been routed by King Edward's new campaign throughout the summer of 1300, which sought to destroy the last opposition to his control of Scotland. However, in August, after a largely fruitless advance that saw little action as the Scots evaded fighting the king head-on, Edward arranged a truce on October 30th and withdrew his army back to England. This left Scotland in complete disarray, as various nobles resigned from the position of guardian, while attempts were made to reinstate John Balliol to the Scottish throne from his exile in Rome. Edward, however, was not done with his proposed conquest of Scotland, and in July 1301, amidst the continued lack of unity within the nation, he launched his sixth campaign, with two armies advancing across the border, one led by his son, Edward Prince of Wales, and the other under his own command. The inability of the Scottish nobles to work together was successfully exploited by the English, who by the winter had captured large swathes of the country before fortifying their position at Linlithgow. Despite an effective guerrilla campaign by the Scots, they suffered a major blow when Robert Bruce, along with other nobles, gave their allegiance to Edward I, their primary motivation being that they had grown weary of sacrificing their fortune, family, and social rank in service to an exiled Scottish king. More serious to the Scottish patriots was the loss of support from both Philip IV of France and the Pope, with Philip facing his own revolts at home that required his attention, and thus took with him any support provided from the papal authority in Rome, Edward agreeing to a 9-month truce in January 1302, but by the autumn of 1302, John Seagrave, 2nd Baron Seagrave, was ordered to make a foray into Scotland as far as Stirling. Unfortunately, in early 1303, his scouting army were ambushed and he was wounded and captured by John Comyn and Simon Fraser, a major victory for the Scots. In May 1303, King Philip of France formally signed a peace with England that omitted any consideration for the Scots, allowing the English king to undertake his final conquest of Scotland during the same month. And by June, he had again reached Linlithgow, Stirling and Perth, the Scots being heavily outnumbered and thus were pushed further and further back as the English continued their advance throughout the summer, eventually reaching Aberdeen in August. All attempts by Simon Fraser and William Wallace to unseat the English being roundly defeated, leading to a majority of the country being under Edward's rule by the new year. On February 9, 1304, all the leading Scots surrendered to the English king, with the exception of Wallace, Fraser and John de Soulis, Fraser seeking to negotiate that prisoners of both sides be released by ransom, and that Edward agree there would be no reprisals or disinheritance of the Scots, with the laws and liberties of Scotland being reinstated to what they had been in the days of Alexander III, Edward agreeing to these terms, and it appeared that all was generally forgiven for those who had sworn fealty to the English monarch. The only exceptions were John de Soulis and William Wallace, Soulis being in exile in France, while Wallace remained a fugitive in Scotland, Edward seeking to make an example of those who had not sworn loyalty to him in February 1304 by focusing his attention on capturing Wallace, putting the burden of this task on John Seagrave, who placed a bounty on Wallace's head, with the reward being an end to Edward's brutal campaign in Scotland. Meanwhile, those nobles who had sworn an oath of allegiance to Edward, including Robert Bruce, worked to form a new government for the Scottish nation, but were secretly plotting their own ambitions, intending to bide their time until the elderly Edward, now in his mid-60s, had passed away, Scotland now being defenceless and rapidly being amalgamated as a vassal state of England, with homage being paid by the nobles and a parliament being held in May 1305 to elect those who would meet later in the year with the English Parliament to discuss rules for the governance of Scotland by the English, thus creating a puppet administration that was firmly under the rule of London. The last vestiges of the Scottish patriots were finally destroyed when William Wallace was betrayed to the English on August 3, 1305 at Rob Royston near Glasgow, being handed over to John Seagrave, who personally conducted him on the long journey southward to his inevitable fate. Taken to London, he was given a quick show trial before being hanged, drawn and quartered on August 23 in the traditional manner of execution for a traitor, his head being placed on a spike at London Bridge, while his limbs were displayed separately in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth as a deterrent against future insurrections. The death of Wallace proving to be the closing chapter of the First Scottish War of Independence, with Robert the Bruce, after a dispute for claimancy of the throne against John Comyn, rising to become Robert I of Scotland on March 25, 1306. Though behind the facade of a unified Scotland and England, the new Scottish monarch had further plans to free his kingdom from English rule, leading to the next chapter of the wider confrontation that would tear apart the British Isles.